Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the CEO of BuellerFootball.com, host of the Football GM podcast, and the 2000 NFL Executive of the Year. Please welcome Randy Mueller to the program. Randy, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Thanks, John. I'm doing great. Can't complain a bit. Good to be back with you.
What was your reaction to the Ryan Poles hiring for the Bears, first off?
I thought it was a good hire. I think their process has been thorough. There's no doubt about that. They've interviewed a lot of people. I do know that Ryan's well thought of throughout the league. He's been around a while, enough to collect plenty of information and knowledge as to how to do the job. And he comes from a winner. So I think the geniality of it all makes sense. So we'll see how he does when he steps up in the big chair. But my reaction initially was good hire.
Were you surprised? Did you think the Bears were going to get someone else?
No, not necessarily. I was a little surprised by their grouping of candidates. He was one of the finalists with the Giants. I have a lot of faith. I think Adam Peters is good, and I think Joe Shane is good. And those were the three finalists that the Giants had. And the way I understand it, two of those three weren't interviewed by the Bears. So I thought maybe they could have included them, but I don't think you can say anything negative about the decision they made and the process that Bill Polian has helped lead throughout the last couple of weeks.
How did you react when you heard about that, Bill Polian helping out? The Bears have done this in the past, as we know, a couple of times, and it hasn't worked out. Do you think Polian's the right guy to help with this process?
Well, I think it's good to have his knowledge base for sure. I think sometimes you've got to be a little guarded in that you hope that person or group doesn't bring their own agendas into the mix as well. You've got to go into it with an open mind, and I think for the most part, Bill's done that. I don't, you worry that they're going to have already selected the guy in their mind before they even start the process because of his past. And so that's always a concern. But I think in this case, the Bears needed a knowledgeable resource. And hey, you can't go wrong with a Hall of Fame GM to be in the room when you're doing your interviews.
Did the Bears reach out to you? Did they ever consider you to help or be a part of the GM search?
No, not at all. I don't have any relationship with really, other than knowing Ted Phillips for a lot of years. Bill and I have been, kind of cohorts throughout our career, although he's got me by quite a few years. No correspondence with the Bears at all.
What do you know about Ryan Poles as, from his time in Kansas City? What do you know about him as a candidate and what he brings to the table?
Well, I think that the association that he has had with a program that has been to 4 straight AFC championship games obviously is easy to see. And I've known Ryan for a little bit. We've spent a lot of time in film rooms throughout the years and college visits or around. And I do think he's a guy that, despite his age, is mature beyond that. And I think that's what, you really need to, when you get an opportunity like this and you're in your 30s, you've got very few people you can count on because you've got to end up at the end of the day deciding things on your own per se. And I think he's been well-schooled, well-trained. I think he's a mature personality. And I think from all I understand, he'll be a good listener, which I think is an undervalued characteristic of the job.
Does the lack of experience as a GM concern you? I mean, some have said this could be like Ryan Pace Part 2. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think so. I think he spent a little more time in decision-making type roles. I think the biggest negative with Ryan Pace was that he'd only been a personnel director for 1 year. And he had kind of come up as a meteoric riser in the personnel end. I think Poles has been around a little longer than that. Again, here's the other thing that you just don't know. First-time GMs, it's a crapshoot, just like first-time coaches. So much of it is the organization you build around them and the people that he brings in. I think it'll be interesting to see not only a coach hire, but there's probably changes in personnel coming as well. And he's going to have his own people with him there. I think that was a struggle for Ryan Pace. He just didn't have a lot of connections. He didn't know a lot of people out there when he got the job. I think Poles is better aligned, maybe a little more politically connected to where he, I think, can bring in help for him that will, help him decide things on a daily basis.
Is this a good situation he's stepping into, do you think?
I think the two things that you hope for when you take a job like this are, one, a quarterback, and it seems like they have that possibility, and two is cap room, because that's your maneuverability, right? I think the Bears, have always spent close to the cap. I don't know that they've ever really pushed it to go over the cap, so to speak. So I think philosophically, that's always been a concern there. Are they willing to spend? Are they willing to go cash over cap, all in, like some teams are? Time will tell. And those are the two things, really. I think they've proved they're supportive of who they choose for the job. I mean, Ryan got to hire 3 coaches, right? I mean, nobody gets to do that. That's unheard of in this day and age. So you'd have to say that the ownership is supportive. That's for sure.
What's his main objective right now?
I think first and foremost, he's got to find a partner, and that's the coach. I mean, I think having been in his shoes, I was 39 when I got the Saints GM job, but I had 17 years in my back pocket in Seattle and had really much been in charge of that program for the 3 or 4 years leading up to it. So I had a little bit of, seasoning. I had a little bit of skin that was thicker skin at that point. And so that's always a concern. I think once he finds his partner, he'll find some comfort, and that partner being the head coach. I think then he'll be charged with helping whoever that is hire a staff. I think for the most part, he's got to get his handle on the team itself. He'll be meeting with medical people left and right because those decisions have to be made right away. Rehab schedules. I would imagine he will meet and reach out to a few players and have some one-on-one sit downs with them. I think he's going to have the biggest adjustment he's going to have is he's not going to have a lot of time to sit down and look at tape. I think that these guys that come from the personnel end, their prior life, they've left that behind now. You don't get chances to sit in a room and pick players anymore. That's not your goal. I mean, it is your goal, but it's not really how your time is going to be spent. You're going to be managing people. So he's going to get tired of talking. At the end of the day, he's going to say, what have I accomplished? But he's had to work the building. He's had to lead. He's had to listen. He's had to communicate. And those are all stepped up times 10 from what he's used to doing. So there's a period of adjustment that got to start early in the morning, and you'll be the last one there at night for a lot of time. That's for sure.
How tough is that to know that he came from a scouting background? Like this guy, he found a lot of good players. I'm sure you did in your day too before you became a GM. So how tough is that trade-off to leave behind film and focus more so on the entirety of the building?
I think the biggest thing is it's very tough, but you need to have your guys. I think you need to have a guy or two who become your go-to evaluators just for that reason. I know I did that in New Orleans, especially. I had guys that I brought 4 or 5 guys with me from Seattle then on the same plane when I came to work. So I had some guys with me that I could count on that could run draft meetings, that understood exactly how I wanted to do it. And so we didn't have to converse a lot. I ended up spending my time managing the building, like you say, but these 4 or 5 guys that I brought with me, one was Mickey Loomis, who is now the longest tenured GM in the league, right? He was with me and came from Seattle with me. So these guys were well versed at how I wanted to do it and how we implemented programs. So I had those guys to lean on, and that gave me a big advantage in that I could communicate. I could work some deals. I could work some contracts, but I also know that those guys knew their roles as well. And it sure made my job as the leader of those guys a lot easier.
Randy Mueller here on Sports Talk Chicago. Randy, how did you go about hiring a coach when you were GM over in New Orleans and Miami?
Well, I interviewed coaches. How about this? When I got on the plane in Seattle to go to New Orleans to take the job, I mentioned these 3 or 4 guys were with me on the plane. We stopped and changed planes in Denver on the way. And I interviewed Gary Kubiak in a layover in Denver airport.
Really?
So it's already rolling. Yeah, it is starting. I think the process of hiring a coach is something that these potential GMs always have in their mind. It's not something that's going to just come up out of the blue. They have a plan for it. I think the evaluations that they collected, that hiring group collected before he got there, there'll be a lot of notes, there'll be a lot of comparisons, there'll be a lot of things to go back and forth on with Bill or whoever else was in that room doing these interviews. So he's got to get up to speed on those as well, as long and they're going to bring some guys in and meet with them face to face. So that's the biggest task he's going to have right now is hiring this coach, and hopefully he can do that in the next few days because they got to get on hiring a staff.
Was it your decision when you hired a coach? Did you have to consult with anybody else, or did you make the final call?
I made the final call, but I also understood there were other people's input who I wanted. I didn't really need to be told that. I got input from, obviously, Mr. Benson in New Orleans had a lot to do with it. The guys that I brought from Seattle had a lot to do with it. We conversed about this stuff 24/7. We kind of knew. I had been through a process a year earlier in that I almost left Seattle for another job in the NFL as a GM. And so I had kind of honed down a list already. So I kind of got a jump on the candidates who I wanted. And I had considered Jim Haslett back then. So one of the criteria I had was when we decided to hire the coach, I wanted someone who would not, this sounds kind of crazy, but I wanted him to be able to put the rest of his life aside. And I knew it would be us for the next couple of months, which means your family, everybody. And we were going 24/7 for the next couple of months. I needed that kind of a partner because I knew the task we had. Now, I don't know what Ryan Poles' criteria is, but most of these guys are wired where it is a 24/7 gig. And so I wanted, and one of the deciding factors was when I hired Jim Haslett, who later that year became coach of the year, and we went to the playoffs. So it was a good hire, in my opinion. I needed a guy that was going to jump in and set the rest of his life aside. And I just made that a priority as one of the criteria. There were some guys that it bogged down. I knew that sometimes, and I always think about this, not to get sidetracked, but the part of the process is the process. This is hard on these coaches. These interviews are hard on them. They're juggling schedules. They're juggling talking to different people. Their phone is ringing nonstop with coaches wanting jobs with them. So I looked at it as I wanted to stretch it out a little bit because I wanted them to be under the gun. I wanted them to have to feel the bright lights of what I was feeling. And so some guys handle that pressure different. There was one or two guys who really struggled and my phone was ringing. Hey, Randy, I got to know these coaches are killing me. They want to, that's all part of the process. Handle it, figure it out. And so these are the kind of things within a process where you learn about people. And so I don't know what Ryan is going to do at the end of the day, but I know this, if he's smart, and I think he is, he will use the process as part of the process.
That is very interesting. I mean, Randy Mueller here on Sports Talk Chicago. I've never heard of this before, so that's why we're having you on to get this inside knowledge. I mean, I never knew that that's kind of how the interview process worked and how you were able to work guys in that sort of way. It's so interesting to think about.
Well, I'm not sure anybody else did it. Maybe that was my simple mind, but I just know that if we're going to find out what these guys are made about on Sundays, to know how it feels to be under the gun, let's put them under the gun. So even when I decided or kind of knew I was down to a final 3, I might wait 2 or 3 days before I even called them back. Make it sweat a little bit, figure it out. Let's go. I mean, it's not for everybody, right? The NFL is hard. Everything you're going to do is hard. You're going to come into now where the spotlight's on you 24/7. I want to glean as much information from the process as I can about you. So that's all. I just tried to make it a unique setup in that, make them sweat. And let's see if I can tell who's sweating the most.
What do you make of the current finalists for the Bears, or the current guys tied to the job?
I think it's a good group. I think it's a diverse group. Obviously, I think they know best what they didn't have before with Matt Nagy. And I think that enters in as well. Sometimes I know when Nick Saban left Miami, we hired a complete opposite in personality. And that's probably a little extreme, but I also know what they think that they know in Chicago, what they were missing and why they made the change with Matt Nagy. I think the next guy will be better at that for sure. Whether that's more accountability, whether it's better game planning, whether it's managing the quarterback better, whatever. And I don't know any of these particulars about the building, but they're going to know that. And the next group or the next guy will have those characteristics if they've done a good job.
Who do you think they'll hire right now?
I don't know. I don't have a clue. I don't know what Ryan's criteria is. I don't know what the rest of the committee, their involvement. I would think they have a criteria all picked out as to what they want. I would hope that they hire somebody with a little far-reaching effect on the building and not just build a little small box that I think coaching has been devalued. I think GMing has been devalued to fit into a little box where everybody else in the building has their own, kingdoms. I think sometimes we put coaches into a tiny little box because you're worried that they might ruffle some feathers, and when they do, that gets some people out of whack as well. I'm for hiring the best leader of men, and we will work around it. That's why a guy like Brian Flores, to me, still, even though he ruffled some feathers in Miami, why not? I like being pushed. I like being questioned, as long as it's done in the right way. Shoot, I worked 2 years for Nick Saban. I'd never been questioned more in my life, but it made me so much better, John, at my job, that I think that's a criteria you've got to factor in. So, I don't know what their criteria is. I don't know who they'll hire, but those are just some of the things that were important to me in hiring a coach.
How do you evaluate guys who've never had coaching experience before?
It's hard. It's really hard because it's a leap of faith. It is, you think you know, but I don't know that you really know. And that might be one of the criteria that we know that was Matt Nagy's first head coaching job. Because of that, you may hire a guy the second time around now that has been there, done that, and there's not much learning curve. Those are the kind of characteristics I'm talking about when you got to know what's left the building and what was missing from that crew. And then when the new guy comes in, he has that in spades. So, maybe that is a Jim Caldwell. Maybe that is somebody that's been through this before, a Brian Flores, or I don't even know who the finalists are, but you can probably pick from that there's a good chance this guy's going to be a veteran coach. Maybe it's a Dan Quinn, somebody that's been through it before, as opposed to another learning curve, younger guy who doesn't have a lot of perspective and experience.
Did you ever interview or seriously consider somebody but no experience?
I would consider everybody. I don't think you can eliminate guys because they don't have experience, but I think in the time that you spend with them, you can kind of sort out how much of a learning curve there's going to be. Is he very naive? Can he appeal to a full, squad? I want to know their philosophy on all three phases: offense, defense, special teams. And I want to know that they can fix all three. I don't want to wait till the end of the season. I don't want to wait till our special teams lose a playoff game for us. I don't want to wait for any of that. I want the head coach to be able to go into the defensive meeting room if he's on offense and say, what the heck are we doing? Here's what we should be doing. So I want a guy that's going to fit and fix all three phases. And that's why I say have a little bigger presence in the building than just an offensive coordinator per se.
Let me ask you this. What's the most important quality or characteristic in looking for a coach?
I think you've got to have a philosophy on all three phases. And I think you have to be unfazed when bad stuff happens, because it's going to happen. Same with the GM. Bad stuff is going to happen. And you've got to be able to fix it and come out of it with unscathed, not even thinking, not even making a second note of it. So those are characteristics I think that are imperative, but they're hard to judge and find unless you've got some history with somebody, or if their feet have been put to the fire and publicly you can make your own decision.
What's the expectation for the Bears come next year if they could hire the right guy and have Poles now as the GM?
Well, I don't think the expectation should ever be anything but to make the playoffs. You've got to be in the playoffs or it's a failure. I think that's a fact. And they've got enough players. They've got enough young talent. They've got enough old talent that really they can add to it. And then it's up to the coach to get them to come together. So I think their expectations are definitely should be playoff level. And once you get in, anything can happen. So I think you've got to get in. You've got to build enough depth to withstand injuries, because it's not if, it's when you're going to have those injuries. And I don't think there's anything wrong with high expectations. I think, that should make us all a little more accountable every day.
Randy Mueller still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Randy, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, Ryan Pace. What did you make of his tenure here in Chicago?
I thought it was really kind of who Ryan is and was. I've known Ryan since he was a young kid. I thought he took the job probably a year or two too early. Didn't really surround himself with the people I thought would make him a better GM and effective. Evaluating players is one thing. Valuing players and deals is something totally different. And I think Ryan's a good evaluator. I think he can look at a film and tell you what he thinks. He just didn't have any background in valuing players, like to make a trade or to make a deal or to build a team. And those characteristics, John, are total different. They're evaluating is not valuing. And I don't think that gets enough attention when a GM gets a job. I know when I got the job in New Orleans, I was young. I came up through the personnel end, but I really had managed the salary cap for 3 years prior to it as well. I did hundreds of deals, and it really helped me value players. I could evaluate them, but I could also put a value on them and know what it took to get them and if it made sense. So many of these GMs now that get these jobs, like Ryan, he comes from the player personnel side, but they don't have any experience in contracts at all. And sometimes organizations purposely want that because they don't want the GM questioning contracts. They don't want you having your hand in a financial pot, so to speak. I think it's a giant mistake. I think that guy needs to have a prerogative to, hey, wait a second, this is too much. Why are we paying this guy? We should pay him this much. I don't want to look at a chart and you tell me where he fits in. I know how he fits with our team. I know what's important for us and how we need to delegate our money. I just think those conversations don't happen enough because they're so worried that he's going to hurt some feelings in his own building of whether it's cap guys or administration or whatever. But I just think a bigger parameter or a bigger box for a GM to go in or a head coach, those are old, forgotten days now. And we just want guys to fill little specific roles as part of a spoke on a wheel.
Was that a Ryan Pace problem or a Bears problem, organizational problem?
Well, it's not Ryan's fault, that's for sure. He had to develop any perspective and valuing on his own, because I know for a fact he wasn't involved in any of that stuff in New Orleans. And so that made it hard for him. I think in the end, if he would have had a seasoned, maybe assistant GM or somebody that had been around and had some, like I say, some skins on the wall, it would have made his job a lot easier. And I think he would have been much more effective.
Did you reach out to him after you heard about the news, or have you heard from him?
No, I have not. I've talked to a couple other people in the league who have talked to him, though, and I think he's just trying to figure out what his next steps are. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up back in some place where he had been before, whether it's with Terry Fontenot in Atlanta or New Orleans. And I don't have anything to base that on. I'm just saying that's usually the way this works out. We all kind of take care of our own, so to speak.
Do you think he'll ever be a GM again?
I think that's a struggle for him. I think had he been on a shorter leash and maybe had not done it with one coach, but he had a chance to hire multiple coaches, and that never works out. I don't think it's going to take a while. That's for sure. I think he's young enough where he could get an opportunity if he kind of goes back to the drawing board and gets some experience in some of these things we've talked about for sure. He's a very good person. And like I said, I think he's a very good evaluator. Just some of the other things he was missing as part of the deal, I think let him down.
Randy, before we finish up today, last question. Did you steal signs from Bill Belichick and Nick Saban?
Nick and I used to laugh about this all the time. I stole enough signals where I knew exactly what he was doing, and I'll be the first on. You could steal signals. That's never been against the law. That have never been against the rules. You just can't video them. I remember one time going from Seattle. We were going to play the Browns in the playoffs, and I went specifically, sat in the stands in Old Brown Stadium, and Nick was the defensive coordinator, and we recorded a lot of signals back in those days, and those were all fun days. And I think we looked forward to some of that. It was challenging and when I say stealing signals, we were getting personnel groupings, things that you normally would get that have been part of football forever. Nothing against the rules at all. This was all, just part of scouting back in those days and advanced scouting. And so, yeah, I might have done a little bit of that in my time.
Well, Randy, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to have you on, and great insights, too, on this Bears hiring and the GM process and how it all works out. And looking forward to having you on again very soon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Always good to be with you.